This session will be about publishing SharePoint with the web application proxy. Little warning, little disclaimer. All my demos are based on Hyper-V, an on-premises installation. So, well, things might or could go wrong. So, just a little warning. You never know. A little bit about myself. My name is Thomas Vochten. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP based out of Belgium. Speaker training. I like to fiddle around with SQL Server a lot too. So I'm a fairly active Twitter, so if you want to ask questions afterwards, we don't have a break after my session, so I'm going to have to speed up. So don't hesitate to come forward after the session or send me a mail or mention me on Twitter to get your question answered. All right, a quick look at what we're going to do in the next hour. We're going to look at the options for publishing SharePoint, what you can do, what you can't do. We are going to look at the web application proxy itself, of course. We'll see how to install and configure it. It's all fairly simple. It's also a very simple product, meant to do simple things like publishing SharePoint. We'll look at the authentication options. We've got different options with the web application proxy. There is a cloud alternative that has been out for a few months that you might consider also. So we'll look at that too. And finally, there are some new things coming in the next server of Windows related to the web application proxy. Okay, about publishing SharePoint. There are a lot of options, right? So if you want to expose your SharePoint farm to the outside world, to the internet, you can put it directly on the internet. Probably not a really good idea, but you could do that. You could just use a single firewall and place your AD and everything behind it with a SharePoint and publish one port to the internet. That will work. Like I said, not necessarily a good idea. You could have a dedicated DMZ farm. There are also all kinds of very interesting topologies that you can find on TechNet, back-to-back, edge firewall, perimeter, etc., all nice options. You could use a reverse proxy like we are going to do right now to proxy requests that are coming in from the internet back to your SharePoint box, wherever it's supposed to be. Or you could use options like VPNs or direct access. There are a lot of options. Now, some reverse proxy solutions. There are many vendors on the market. We've got Citrix, Cisco, F5, Chem, Microsoft even. And you know, well, Microsoft, the network people don't really like them, right? So if you go to a customer and you say, okay, network people, we want to republish SharePoint to the outside world, and we're going to put a Microsoft product right in front of it and expose it on the internet. Now, you all know that's also always a very interesting fight. A few weeks ago, I was at a customer, no, a few months ago, I was at a customer, and we had a discussion about requirements, and I said, well, let's talk to the network team. And my client was already a bit hesitant. And then we went to the network team, and before we even entered, there was a sign on the door that says this. No less, no more, just no. So I know that talking to network people about, well, Microsoft security products is a bit of a challenge. I agree, but well, sometimes it can be, sometimes it can be fun, right? In the Microsoft space, traditionally we had two products, Microsoft TMG and the newer one, Microsoft UAG. Unfortunately, the support or the mainstream support for these products ended last week. So if you're still using it, you might consider other options. I'm not saying that the web application proxy, what we are going to do today, is absolutely alternative to TMG and UAG. No, it isn't. It offers much less options than TMG and UAG did in the past. So that's well, probably the most important key takeaway from this session. So it can do a lot of things, but not everything that the older products could do. So if you were looking to replace those products by something else, web application proxy can be an alternative, but you might want to look at other options too, if you're looking for advanced scenarios. Okay, just some general considerations about publishing SharePoint via a reverse proxy server. Well, you could publish any site collection. A path-based site collection, that's a traditional approach where the URL is determined by the URL of the web application, or even for hostname site collections, where every site collection has its own URL. So it's both supported. That's no problem. If you're using path-based site collections, you can publish your SharePoint environment via the alternate access mappings and the zones. Probably after all these years, most of you know how that is, how that's done. Something else that you can do with SharePoint is SSL termination and offloading. Okay, I don't really like it anymore, but you could do that. By the way, the web application proxy does not support SSL offloading for SharePoint, that is. If you're publishing SharePoint, don't forget to publish the supporting services like Office Web Applications. Should also be exposed to the outside world if you want to use SharePoint. And then the SharePoint apps. Now we've got two types of SharePoint apps. SharePoint provider hosted apps that use their own hosting. Publishing them is not a big deal. Depends on how you configure authentication for them. But the SharePoint hosted apps, which use this special constructed funky URL with a GUID in it, well, that's something else. We are going to talk about that a little bit later. Web application proxy does not support those at the time, but I have a hard time, with other vendors too. So, well, that's also a nice debate everywhere. A little bit about rewriting and redirecting. If you're reverse proxying SharePoint, what can you do? What can't you do? You have to be careful because not everything is supported. I've seen very horrible constructs in reverse proxy solutions or SSL VPN gateways that try to change the URLs of SharePoint, and all kinds of stuff starts to break then. So be very careful. Before you try to do something with rewriting or redirecting, understand the concept of alternate access mappings. That is very important. Now, the base principle in rewriting, redirecting, whatever, is that whatever URL the user sees in its browser, the end user that is actually using your SharePoint, must be a public URL in SharePoint. If you adhere to that principle, most of the time, you're okay. So don't do something else. Don't configure a URL like portal.contoso.com on your reverse proxy server and not let SharePoint know about it. That's not supported and will not work in a few scenarios. So if you want to rewrite something, you could do symmetrical rewrite. That's what you see here. So contoso.com/site/site1. You could rewrite that to fabricam.com/site/site1. So you can't change the /sites/site1, for example. That's something you cannot rewrite from sites, like in the following example, from site1 to /sites/site1. That's not supported. Don't do that. All the different options regarding rewriting and redirecting are in a nice knowledge base article. It's been around for a few years, but it's still valid for SharePoint 2013. It's there for reference. You don't have to take notes if you don't. It's going to be on DVD. So but it's still very valuable. So about SSL offloading. SSL offloading means terminating the SSL request at the device, the reverse proxy, or even at load balancers. And it will then forward a normal HTTP request to SharePoint. So the SSL request is terminated at the device, and then SharePoint will get a normal HTTP request. And based on the alternate access mappings, SharePoint will then reply with HTTPS in its response. That's how it's done with path-based site collections. With hostname site collections, alternate access mappings are not used, because every site has its own URL, and you cannot put them all in the alternate access mappings. It's just not how it works. So there are some specifics about publishing or offloading SSL with hostname site collections. I did another session on Monday that you might want to have a look at if you're interested in that, because I talk all the time about hostname site collections. Basically, it all boils down to implementing a custom HTTP header on your reverse proxy so that SharePoint knows that the original request was an HTTPS request. And then it will just answer every request that comes in for HTTP, which HTTPS. It's just another kind of alternate access mapping, more or less. Or the behavior is more like alternate access mappings. Like I said, SharePoint apps, provider-hosted apps, not really a big problem. They're just normal websites. Depends on what you do with them, of course. But SharePoint-hosted apps, those are the problematic ones. So your main SharePoint site could be contoso/site/web1, normal URL, but your your app, your SharePoint hosted app will run in something, well, prefix and then a GUID and then a special domain name. The problem is that SharePoint, every time you instantiate a SharePoint hosted app, will create one of those websites with a unique URL for you, and you cannot control that. So there should be a way to let your reverse proxy server know that whatever .contosoapps.com should go to your SharePoint server, and not every reverse proxy server supports that. And in its current version, Web Application Proxy does not. So if you want to publish your SharePoint hosted apps, you might have to look at something else. Now, about this Web Application Proxy, it's a reverse proxy server. No more, no less. That's about it. It does not do any fancy stuff like the other products do. So it has very, very, very simple functionalities. It's by no means a replacement for UAG and TMG. So if you want to do really, really exotic stuff, you probably won't be able to use the Web Application Proxy. The good thing is that it's included with Windows Server 2012 R2, and that it's free, if you've got a license for Windows, of course. So it's a free product. But you have to be on the latest bits to be able to use it. Another important thing is that it uses ADFS as the backend. Now, even if you're not really using ADFS today for Office 365 or for other federation scenarios, you do need ADFS installed on a server to be able to use the Web Application Proxy. The Web Application Proxy is a very simple device, and all its configuration is kept in ADFS. So you need an ADFS server. But installing ADFS for the Web Application Proxy is no big deal either. And one of the most interesting things about the Web Application Proxy is that it can do pre-authentication. If you're just putting a firewall on the internet and then your SharePoint server somewhere behind, and you're just going to SharePoint, well, if you don't do anything special, your request will go to the SharePoint server before you're being authenticated. And then SharePoint will say, oh, sorry, access denied, I don't know you. Please go authenticate. But that's probably not what we want, especially not if SharePoint is somewhere in our local intranet. That's not what we want. So pre-authentication, being able to authenticate the user before it reaches SharePoint, is a very important feature of the Web Application Proxy, and there are a few scenarios that it covers. So to sum up the requirements, we've got the latest Windows Server version and ADFS. Now it's important, ADFS 3.0, as you read on the internet somewhere, does not exist. There is no such thing as ADFS 3.0. The ADFS guys are very, very specific about that. So don't talk to ADFS guys about ADFS 3.0. It doesn't exist. It's ADFS with Windows Server 2012 R2, right? Simple, right? But it doesn't exist. And then you need a SQL Server database because, again, ADFS stores its own configuration in a SQL database. You don't have to install a special instance if you don't want to, or a specific SQL server, especially for the Web Application Proxy. If you don't want to do that, there is a Windows internal database that comes with ADFS that you can use as an alternative, and that's free. Yes? A Web Application Proxy is the new incarnation of the ADFS proxy. So if you've been using ADFS before, ADFS 2.0, 2.1, then you could install ADFS as an ADFS proxy in a special role configuration. And in the newer version, this is the replacement for the ADFS proxy. So the Web Application Proxy is also an ADFS proxy. Yeah, even if you're using Windows authentication and not SAML authentication like with normal ADFS and federation. And last but not least, you need certificates because it has to be secure, right? So you need a certificate to secure your web traffic. You need a certificate for ADFS. That is, we can't do without them. So yeah, those were the two certificates. We've got an internal ADFS certificate that it uses to sign the traffic between the ADFS server and the Web Application Proxy, so that's secure. And then we've got another certificate for your traffic. You could use a different certificate inside and outside. I mean, if your users are browsing to your SharePoint resources internally, they don't go via the Web Application Proxy. They can use a certificate on the SharePoint box, but you can have another certificate on the Web Application Proxy if you want to. You could have an internal one from your internal CA internally, and then an external from an external CA on the outside on your web application proxy. That is absolutely supported. So you can use any type of certificate, a normal, wildcard, even a SAN certificate. That's no problem. That's all supported. And don't forget to import the certificate root, especially if you're installing web application proxy in a web workgroup, which will not automatically trust your internal CA if you're using your internal certificates. There was a question somewhere. Yeah.
Can you use the wildcard certificate on ADFS web proxy?
Sorry, can you?
Can you use wildcard cert?
Yes, you can. Yes, I'm doing that in my demonstration. I've got one wildcard certificate for my domain, and I'm using it for SharePoint, for ADFS, for everything. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but, sorry?
For particular applications to export.
Yes, that could be. You could expose your portal, your My Sites, if they all have different URLs, all through the same wildcard certificate if you want to, yes. Okay, security features. Don't show this slide to the network guys. Right? Because the security features, as they are on TechNet, they're more architecture, perhaps. So the problem is that there is not many information published on what exactly the web application proxy does. There are no certifications or anything, so, well, that's why you have a hard time convincing your network people to use web application proxy sometimes. There is not much information available, unfortunately. So it terminates the HTTP traffic, and then it makes a new connection to SharePoint. That's what it says in this first line. Luckily, it also drops unwanted traffic. That's okay. You can use custom authorization rules where you can configure who and who cannot use your SharePoint site from the outside. That's based on claims. That's something you can configure in ADFS itself. Also fairly simple. We'll see that in a demonstration. And, well, ADFS itself supports all kinds of very interesting features that I'm probably not going to show you today, but we're a bit short on time for that. But things like workplace join, where you can have non-domain joined machines or tablets authenticate to your ADFS environment transparently, so without having to log in, etc. That's also possible. And web application proxy supports those features too. Now, it's very simple topology, and more or less the one I'm going to use in my demonstration. You've got your user on the internet, you've got a firewall, and you have to use a firewall still. Don't put your web application proxy on the internet directly. So use two firewalls, at least two firewalls. I've put my web application proxy in the DMZ. I've put my other boxes in the LAN. You will see that there are two configurations possible. So it's a very simple setup, and it also reflects what I'm doing in my lab for my demo. You can also make everything highly available. So both the ADFS farm, because that's called a farm if you've got multiple ADFS servers, and your web application proxy can be made highly available through the use of load balancers. Typically, you would use the same federation name. That's the URL that is used by the web application proxy itself, both internally and externally, to make it work, basically. So you can have multiple web servers and multiple ADFS servers connected through a load balancer, and then you could cluster your SQL server that supports your ADFS data. So that's pretty simple. Now, we've got two deployment options. You can install the web application proxy as a domain member. Again, an interesting discussion with your network people, especially if you're putting it in your DMZ. Well, when do you have to do that? If you want to use Windows authentication. If your SharePoint only supports Windows authentication, NTLM or Kerberos, well, you have to put your web application proxy in the same domain, even if it's in the DMZ. You could also put your proxy in the workgroup. Then you only have to open one port, 443, to the inside, to your SharePoint resource. And you can do that if you don't want pre-authentication, because it's also possible. You can just send any request to SharePoint and don't do any pre-authentication if you want to, but why would you do that? Or if you're using ADFS or SAML authentication, then you can also use put your web in the workgroup. In my demonstration, I have both. So I have one web server in the domain and one web server in the workgroup. And I'll demonstrate both scenarios. So if you want to put your web server in a domain, these are the usual suspects, the ports that you have to open. That's why the network people don't like you again. So a lot of ports. but if you don't, it doesn't work. You can't be a domain member without these ports, without opening them. And if you have your web server in a workgroup, it's just one single port. Everything is done through port 443. But again, it depends on what kind of SharePoint configuration you have, which topology you can use. You cannot just choose workgroup because it's more secure, and then use Windows authentication with SharePoint. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Okay, so some limitations. Like I said, no wildcard domain publishing with the funky URL for apps doesn't work in the current iteration of the web application proxy. So if you want to use SharePoint hosted apps, you might have to look at something else. It doesn't do SSL offloading for SharePoint at this time, so that's a problem. You cannot add additional HTTP headers if you want that. For example, if you proxy your requests through the web application proxy to SharePoint, you cannot see the client IP address, the original client IP address in the logs of SharePoint. It's always the IP address of the application proxy. It's not really convenient, perhaps. If you want to use the more advanced features of ADFS like workplace join, there is an AD schema change involved. Not for everything I'm going to show you today. No schema changes are required. And we've got only limited security features, like I already said. Installation and configuration of the web application proxy just basically is next finished. You install and configure ADFS if you're not already running it. That's not that easy, not that difficult. You add the web application proxy role. It's part of remote access, so it's just a role feature that you have to install. You can do it through the GUI or through PowerShell. It's very important that you check your certificate and requirements and name resolution, especially if you're putting your web application proxy in a workgroup. See that you have to make sure that your web application proxy can resolve the name of your ADFS internal DNS server, federation server, ADFS server. So you might have to fiddle around with host files or just configure your DNS server in DMZ to route requests to do name resolving for your ADFS server. Then you have to configure the trust between ADFS and web. It's also one single line of PowerShell, or a few clicks in the GUI. And then you can finally publish your web applications to the outside world. I'm not going to show you live how to install and configure ADFS or the web application proxy. I've got a few screenshots that demonstrate how it's done. Otherwise, we would be here for, well, too long, I guess. Yes? No. No, web application proxy requires the latest ADFS version. Yeah, it doesn't work with other versions. So you really have to install the latest ADFS version too. So installing ADFS, it all begins with that. It's just clicking Active Directory Federation Services, and then you have the choice to create a new ADFS farm or to join an existing one. Now we're creating a new one, so just one click. Install a new farm, then you have to select a certificate. I've got my wildcard certificate, star.thvo.net, that's my domain. And then you have to choose a federation service name, that's just a display name. No, sorry, that's not just a display name. That is the URL that ADFS will use to communicate with the user. So in my case, that's fed from federation.thvo.net. So a certificate and a federation service name that it's in the same namespace as the SSL certificate. And now we've got a display name that we will use on the web pages that the web application proxy uses. Then you have to specify a service account. In this example, it's a web application proxy that is part of my domain, so it's a domain account. But if you're installing in a workgroup, that is not needed. But this is a domain-joined web application proxy. And then you can choose to install ADFS on a SQL server that you have flying around somewhere, or to use the Windows internal database, like in my example. And then ADFS is basically installed. For basic operations, you don't have to do anything with ADFS at this point. It's only when you publish your applications that you should make some changes or configuration changes in ADFS. Installing a web application proxy is just as simple. It's also going to the server manager. It's a bit hidden away, so it's not just there. So you cannot just select web application proxy. You have to install a remote access role first, And if you select the remote access role, in the next screen, you will have the choice to install Web Application Proxy. So yeah, the first time you have to look for it a bit. Then a very important screen, you have to point your Web Application Proxy server to your existing ADFS server that we just installed. So you specify the federation service name, in my case, fed.thvo.net, so that's where name resolution is important. Can be a host file, like I said. And a username that has rights on the ADFS server to configure the trust between your Web Application Proxy and your ADFS server. So in this case, it's a domain account, and it's a domain administrator. And then last but not least, you select a certificate. That does not need to be the same certificate, like I said. You could have a certificate here that is generated by a public authority, whereas internally, you could use one that is generated internally. So, but in my case, I'm using the same one for demonstration purposes. When that's done, you've got your Web Application Proxy installed, and this is the Web Application Proxy administration screen. Fabulous, isn't it? There is nothing there. One publish button, that's it. No properties, you cannot select something else, but it's all done through PowerShell, but even the PowerShell commands, as you will see, there's not much. So it's a very, very, very simple installation. And these are the only PowerShell command that's involved in the Web Application Proxy. So you can basically configure the trust with ADFS, you can create an application to publish, and that's about it. So it's all relatively simple. Okay, what are our authentication options? Let's dive into them a bit more. Pre-authentication with Windows requires Kerberos constraint delegation. Why? Because if we're going to the Web Application Proxy, the Web Application Proxy will, on our behalf, log into the SharePoint server for us. That's why we need Kerberos constraint delegation. I will show you in the demo what we need exactly. If we're using XAML claims, so that's ADFS, for example, or another identity provider, we can also configure that for pre-authentication. It works with ADFS, basically. So if you're using ADFS for federation or to log on to SharePoint, you can use this for pre-authentication too. I will also show you that in the demo. Or you do not do pre-authentication, and all requests are just proxied to the backend, and they're authenticated by SharePoint. Okay, with Windows, to configure Kerberos constraint delegation, you have to do the traditional stuff, so create SPNs. You have to create an SPN for your Web Application Proxy. If it's not already created, you have to create one for SharePoint and for SQL Server. We will also do that in the demonstration. And then we have to delegate the web server. We have to give it the rights to talk to SharePoint on our behalf, and that's why we enable Kerberos constraint delegation. That's also one click, basically. And then we have to configure SharePoint to use Kerberos to log on. Also one click. And an application pull recycle, but well. And finally, we have to configure ADFS and a Web Application Proxy to work with this configuration and to publish it to the internet. We've got additional authentication capabilities like Workplace Join for the non-domain joint machines. But like I said, it has additional requirements, and unfortunately, I don't have time to demonstrate that. If you want to see how that works, there was a nice video on Channel 9 from the SharePoint conference last year by Chris Johnson. He demonstrates something with an iPad and a Surface and how non-domain joint machines can use the Web Application Proxy. Very interesting stuff. Something else, based on ADFS, you can do multi-factor authentication. So that you don't need your username and password, but also, I don't know, a text message to log in. Also configurable through ADFS and the Web Application Proxy. More of an advanced scenario, I guess. These are the clients that are supported for the Web Application Proxy, or these are the protocols or the mechanisms that are supported. In a browser, that's an HTTP redirect. It's all based on redirects. The Office clients use the MSOFBA protocol. There is very interesting protocol documentation on MSDN that you should read. It's very interesting. And then we've got a web authentication broker that is used by REST services or Windows clients, Windows apps, for example. Okay, before we do the demo, how does it work, pre-authentication? First, the client tries to access the SharePoint site, fires a request, DNS resolving, and then you arrive at the the web application proxy. The web application proxy then sends your requests to ADFS. ADFS performs the authentication, asks you for a username and a password. You can do this with form-based authentication, as you will see, to do it in a more secure way. ADFS then redirects your request back to the web application proxy, and it gives you a special cookie, an edge token. And with that edge token, the web application proxy will validate the request. And finally, with that edge token, you can go back to SharePoint and access your resources. So it's not until the end that you access the SharePoint box. If you just do no pre-authentication, your request goes directly to the SharePoint box. So it's only at the end when you're positively authenticated. All right, let's see how it works. I've got 8 virtual machines here, so I hope it will still work. This is I've got 2 farms. This is one of these farms, my first farm, and the farm is using ADFS already. That means it uses SAML authentication to authenticate. If I open my browser, but the application is already warmed up, so it will be very fast, I guess. And we go to our SharePoint site. That is SF01. I've got multiple farms. Teams.thvo.net. If we visit that site, we will be redirected to the federation server. That was ADFS. You could notice that. And then we are logged into our SharePoint box. So we're not using Windows authentication in this example. This is purely ADFS and SAML. I've got a claims viewer web part here that that you can use to see all the claims, and you don't see an SID in here, so I'm not using any Windows authentication. Okay, to publish this to the outside world, because now we see that you can just connect to it and it's all transparent, we have to go to our federation server, to our ADFS server. So this server is in the internal network, it's not in the DMZ, and because we're using ADFS authentication, it's already configured. So SF01, the team site, is already in ADFS because that's what we use to access our SharePoint. Now, if we want to publish this to the outside world, I've got a web application proxy on this machine. You see the fantastic interface, and it's already connected to this ADFS server. So the only thing we have to do is click the publish button. I hope the resolution will work. And then we can say, okay, this is an ADFS server. We want to use ADFS pre-authentication to publish our SharePoint application. Next. Then it will talk to the ADFS server, and it will give a list of all the possible relying parties, as it's called. And it's already here, so that's cool. Next. And we have to give some information. The name, that is just purely for, well, to see what rule you're configuring. So I can take, well, 1SF02 teams, just some name. And then the external URL. Should be SF01. Okay, and then take a certificate. I already installed a certificate on the web application proxy. So this is the external URL, and this is the backend server URL. I'm going to copy this. Next, this is the PowerShell command that you can use alternatively. I wish every SharePoint screen would do this. This is not SharePoint, but it would be very nice in central administration to have something like that, but maybe I should put that on the user voice side. Publish. And our application should be published to the outside world. My laptop, let's pretend he's on the internet. We can just, if we wait for a few seconds, because it takes a few seconds to see. Okay, now we get this. So my laptop is on the outside world, on the internet, so I'm not logged on automatically. I'm not using my Windows credentials. I'm not on the domain, so I can just try to log on here. Now, this is using XAML, so I have to use a syntax like, in my case, I have to use my UPN to log in. And if you would open ULS Viewer, you will see that just in the end, SharePoint will be getting the request because we are pre-authenticated. So now we are logged into our server again from the internet directly. that's very simple scenario. Yes? None. I'm using hostname site collections, and I'm not using SSL offloading, so I can just choose any URL that is in SharePoint and send it to SharePoint, and that will work. I have not configured any alternate access mappings. Yeah, well, this is a bit of a special case because the ADFS, this is a XAML authentication scenario, so it's not using Windows authentication. Every user that uses SharePoint goes already through ADFS. Yeah. I will show you the Windows authentication part in a few seconds. So that was fairly simple. Now we don't need this farm anymore, so for sake of performance, I'm going to stop a few virtual machines now, because I'm using another farm to do Windows authentication. Let's hope I don't shut down the wrong service. For the next demonstration, we're going to demo pass-through authentication. So I've got another SharePoint farm here, which has a site, a project site, which looks like this. And you saw this is internal traffic, so I'm automatically, transparently logged on. But let's publish this application. To publish this application, because this is using Windows authentication and not ADFS already, now we have to configure ADFS. So it's a brand new ADFS server without any configuration. We go to trust relationships, relying party trust. So this ADFS server is just there to be able to use the web application proxy. We're not using it for SAML authentication or anything else. What we have to do is, oh, I made a mistake. I have to be on the web application proxy. Sorry. Go to the web application proxy. I forgot we were doing no pre-authentication, but just pass-through. Now we can just go to the application proxy server, publish, next, and then choose pass-through. This is the simplest configuration, I guess. So give the name, projects, use an external URL, preferably the same one as internally, makes life easier. Oops. Choose a certificate. And then publish. Again, PowerShell, published successfully. Now let's wait a few seconds. Open our browser on the internet and see what happens. Nothing. Let's wait a few seconds again. Come on. There it is. So it's a direct connection. There is no forms-based authentication. It's just Windows authentication. My traffic is going directly to the server. SPAdmin, for example, one of my users, we should have the necessary rights, and I'm on the SharePoint site. This is not necessarily something you want to do, of course, because it's not doing any pre-authentication whatsoever. Now, the other scenario is with pre-authentication. Now, to use Windows pre-authentication, we have to configure Kerberos. So to do that, we need to go to Active Directory and make some changes. The application pool account for my SharePoint site is this one, SF02 content. I have to add a service principal name. And that is the classic one. And I will put in the URL of my SharePoint site as sf02teams.thvo.net. And then we have to give the web application proxy server, which is in my domain this time, the necessary rights to delegate to that application pool. So I'm going to my computer account, properties, delegation, trust this computer for delegation to specified services only, use authentication protocol, use any authentication protocol, and then I have to type my application pool account. Okay. This is all standard Kerberos configuration. Now, I already configured my web application for Kerberos because that would take even longer, so we're not going to do that. I also configured my SQL Server for Kerberos authentication before the demo. So, SharePoint should be using Kerberos now. Now we have to configure our ADFS server to make that work. We're going to our federation server. And we add a relying party trust. Now, it's a bit confusing. We are going to add a non-claims aware relying party trust. Now, you might say SharePoint 2013 does use claims. That's true. But as far as ADFS is concerned, non-claims aware means no XAML claims. We are using Windows claims. So for ADFS, that is as we are not using claims. So we add a non-claims aware relying party trust. We give it a name. It's a bit of an ADFS convention to do it like this, URN, colon, and then SharePoint, but you could put whatever you want in here, basically. Team, that's just an identifier for the configuration we are going to load. Okay. Oh, did I do something wrong? Yeah, this was a display name, but it doesn't matter. This is the identifier. Next, next. I don't want to use fancy stuff like multi-factor authentication. Next, 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 finish. And now we're going to edit the authorization rules to make sure that everyone is allowed to use this application, to use SharePoint on the internet. We're going to add a rule. You can do all kinds of interesting things here based on what group you're in or what identity properties you have, but we're going to permit all users for the sake of the demo, so everyone can use SharePoint from the internet. And then finish. Okay, you see we didn't have to specify the URL of SharePoint, we didn't have to specify the SPN that we just created. That's something we're going to do on the web application proxy itself. Okay, now we're on the web application proxy and we're going to publish this second site. Next, and it's not using pass-through, it's using ADFS for pre-authentication. And then there is the identifier. I should have specified a nicer display name, but okay. Next, and now we can again fill in the same details. This is my team site. That's the external URL. Oops, don't make typos or everything will be. It's always typos or permissions, right? Start.thio.net. It's the same certificate I'm using for the other site. And here we have to specify the SPN that we created in Active Directory. So that was HTTP SF02 teams.thio.net. Next, again, nice PowerShell command and publish. And with a little bit of luck, if I go to my internet box, I will be able to log into my site with Windows authentication this time. Let's wait a few seconds. Okay, then we agree with a forms-based authentication screen. This time it's Windows, so we can do things like this. And if all went well, we are on our site. So now we're logged in using Windows credentials, using Kerberos, and the web server is delegating our credentials to the SharePoint server. So we can safely log on to our server. Okay, you see, well, we've explored 3 different configurations: ADFS, no pre-authentication, and Windows authentication. It's all relatively simple. Okay. There is, web application proxy is nice, but if you don't want to install new servers, you have to install an ADFS server, maybe more, a web application proxy server, maybe more. If you don't want to do that, there is a nice alternative now, and it's called the Azure AD application proxy. Of course, if there is a new alternative, it has to do something with the cloud, right? So Azure AD application proxy, what is it? It's Azure hosted service, so you already have to use Azure. You already have to use synchronized identities, so you should already have a connection to Azure, have your user directory connected to Azure. That is a requirement. You have to have Azure AD Premium, also a requirement. It's just like the web application proxy, but in the cloud. So what happens is you can download a component that you install on a server somewhere. You give that server, like the web application proxy, delegation rights with Kerberos, like we did in our example, just that server, and then your application will end up in your My Apps page in Azure or in Office 365, and then you can just publish your internal SharePoint application through Azure AD to the outside world. It sounds very exotic, but it actually works. If you want to know more about it, there is a very nice blog post. I suppose it's a little bit too long and too small to take notes now, but it will be in the slides. So there is a nice blog post posted 2 weeks ago by Kirk Evans, who is also here. So if you see the chance, go talk to him about it. It's a very nice option. It's I think it's already released now. So it's just web application proxy, but in the clouds. But you have to have an Azure AD connection. But if you don't want to do all this cloud stuff, you can use the web application proxy, right? And to end, Windows Server vNext has some new interesting features related to the web application proxy. You can finally do wildcard domain publishing for your SharePoint apps, so things like star.contosoapps.com, that will be possible in the next version. There are more features than I'm going to show you right now, but these are the interesting ones for SharePoint. You can do HTTP to HTTPS redirection, so user can type in portal.contoso.com with HTTP, and then it will be redirected to HTTPS the first time he connects. So it's not rewriting, it's redirection. And also we will have support for the X-forwarded4 HTTP header, and that's the header that specifies the original client address of the user. So you can look at your IIS logs and see the original client IP address that was used to connect to SharePoint. Nice to make some statistics and everything. Okay, some takeaways. Know the support limits when publishing SharePoint. Know about rewriting, what is supported, what is not supported, redirecting. Learn about ADFS because you will need it to have web application proxy enabled. Kerberos is not dead. If you've been to Spencer's session, you will also know that, but Kerberos is not dead. It's still useful, even in this claims world. Pre-authentication is your friend. Don't do without it. Pre-authentication is, it works, it's nice. And your network team is your friend too, by the way. So. Firewalls are still needed. Don't put your web application proxy server directly on the internet. Firewall before, firewall after the web application proxy is still a very valid and secure configuration. And have a look at the cloud alternative. Maybe we should do a session next year just about the cloud alternative, right? Okay, we're a little bit short on time, but thank you for attending. If you still have any questions, I'll be around here for the rest of the day. Well, I know that's just 1 hour, but I'm still here. You can also send me a tweet if you want to ask a question or send me an email, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Thank you.